Welcome to our students, and it was a great pleasure that I would like to introduce Andrew Wells, who's kindly come along to talk about his experience on change management. Dr. Andrew Wells has been a management consultant for over 30 years and is an industry partner of Birmingham Business School through his firm One Point Three. So this relationship has been for many years, and it's really exciting to be able to draw on Andrew's experience in terms of this particular module. Andrew has a wide range of clients in many different sectors, the public sector, the financial services, manufacturing and armed forces, just as a few examples. His experience is vast, and he has consulted on various change management topics. So, for example, looking at business strategy, leadership and executive coaching. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Andrew and to ask him to share with us some of his experiences of change in these critical sectors. So, Andrew, I'm going to change to speaker view now, and Pete and I will leave the room for a little while to give you an opportunity to go through some of these ideas that we're really excited about hearing.
Well, thanks Julie, and thank you very much for having me, and hello virtually to everyone who's tuning into this. When we talked about doing this short video, we talked about presenting some ideas to get a conversation going, just to seed a few prompts for people to talk about things to do with change. And the way we structured this was to think about five questions and see where those 5 questions lead. So perhaps what I might do is just list the 5 questions and then see if I can't answer them with a few thoughts. Now, I'm a management consultant, I'm not an educator, so please bear with me. And the idea that I've got in mind here is, as I say, to actually just land a few points that are discussion points, much more than being, you know, the gospel according to, or how change should always be done. But let's take a few ideas. Now then, first question I've got, first question was, how might organisations go about determining the core issue or the aim of the change programme? Second question was about communication. What communication channels have proved most effective in implementing and managing change? Third question, what key leadership attributes can help facilitate change initiatives? Number 4, what advice would you give to change leaders to sell their ideas? And number 5 was about, are there any key micro skills you can identify that might facilitate getting buy-in to the change programme? So let me run down those one at a time, and then perhaps we might open up the discussion a bit with Julie and Pete at the end of this. So question number 1 was, how might organisations go about determining the core issue or aim of the change programme? And that's a cracking question. And for me, the reason why it's such a good question is because it really drives at the first and master principle of change. And the first and master principle of change is, to put it succinctly, the selection and maintenance of the aim. Now, you hear a lot of talk about, certainly these days, you hear a lot of talk, it's very popular to talk about start with why. And understanding why you're going to try and shift something or change something is important. But I would suggest you go a little bit further than that and think about the what and the why. What are we seeking to achieve and why? So it's important to understand aim. Let's say that's the first and master principle of change. Interestingly, actually, I had a client a couple of years ago who was before I met him, he had been a senior officer in the Royal Marines. And I was talking to him about change. We were talking about the program that we're involved in, and we were talking about the purpose of it. And he said to me, do you know the first principle of war? Which I'm afraid I didn't. And he said, that's the selection and maintenance of the aim, which is interesting. Now, I'm not at all suggesting that change is anything like warfare, but it's very interesting that they share that same first and master principle. And if you're going to diagnose a change program that might not be going on track, start thinking about, is the aim clear? Now let's take a couple of ideas from that statement. One is the selection of the aim. What is it we're trying to achieve? The point I'd land on this one is to think about effect. So how might organizations go about determining the aim? Think about effect. Conversation I had actually only last week with a chap. He has a fairly sizable operation, and he was saying, actually what I want is I want my leadership team to be effective, and I want the leaders in my organization to be effective. And the conversation we had was really about changing the noun and the adjective around, so that rather than talking about effective teams, we might think about team effect. What effect do we want this team to have? Rather than talking about effective leaders, we might talk about leadership effect. What's the outcome that we're after here? And then once we start thinking along those lines, we might then just pick the 3 auxiliary verbs and apply those to our thinking. And the auxiliary verbs, of course, are to be, to have, to do. What do we want to be as a result of this change? What do we want to have as a result of this change? And then the third one, which is probably the most important of all, is what do we want people in our organization to do? And that means actually we can define the outcome of change using verbs. So, and that's actually quite an important one when we talk about a culture change or a shift in culture. There was a piece of work we did probably about 8-10 years ago now. And it was about bringing 5 different businesses together to form a division. It was actually a civil nuclear business. And the idea was to take these 5 previously separate and autonomous businesses, bring them together. And the exam question we were asked was, so how do we prompt a cohesive culture? And the way we did it actually was just to focus on 3 verbs of what we wanted people to do. And the 3 verbs were care, connect, trust. And actually just using those 3 simple ideas, we were able to construct the basis of the culture that we wanted to see. And it was really very, very, very simple, but very effective way of going about it. So piece of advice on developing cultures. One of the things you hear a lot about, if you ask people about their culture or their organization, they'll typically talk to you in nouns and adjectives. We want trust, we want teamwork, we want respect, we want integrity, whatever it is, okay? Actually, one of the things to do is to switch away from that and just think in terms of verbs. What do we actually want people to do and give them that? Because it's what you do that actually makes you the money or has the environmental effect or gives you the social benefit or develops your reputation. So that's one of the things to think about there. Second point in that statement about selection and maintenance of the aim is to understand what maintenance means. And maintaining the aim means that the aim of your program needs to be delivered with some clarity at the point of need. And the point of need is when a decision is made, wherever it is in the organization, a decision is made in which is going to affect the outcome of your change program. So one of the things you must look at is how do we get our message, our aim, into that space every time without fail. The other thing about maintaining an aim is your aim will evolve with circumstance, so you must be flexible about it. And the third thing, and one of the most important things here, is we go back to the chap who was in the Royal Marines, and you think about the selection and maintenance of the aim in a military context, there is an assumption in that statement that actually there is a very effective chain of command and a very effective way of communicating along that chain of command. There's an expectation in the organization that good communication follows. It's not always the case. You shouldn't always assume that in a civilian organization. And in fact, in most organizations, communication isn't really all that good. So again, if you're going to diagnose a a change program, you might think about not only is our aim clear, but also how effectively is it communicated. So that's hopefully some prompts on question number one. Question number two is about communication channels. And the way this one was asked to me is, so in your experience, what's proved most effective in implementing and managing change in terms of communication channels? Well, the first thing I'd suggest on that is actually just switch away from the idea of communication, because it is a misunderstood term. And what I would suggest is you think not about communication channels, but conversation channels. How does the conversation work in the organization? And because every organization will have a conversation going on in it. And actually, in terms of change, it's the conversation that's important. It's the informal communication that goes on in the place. You know, and a lot about getting change to happen is about getting the gossip going in the organization, but doing that in a positive way about the change you're trying to introduce. So my points on this one would be, think about how conversation works in the organization more than communication. Tap into the way it naturally works and the way it works already. And then, if necessary, you might look at how you might start up other channels of conversation. And in particular, is to allow time for conversation to flow. And there are simple things which you'll know about. So at the beginning of a meeting, allow people time just to shoot the breeze, to talk to each other about what's going on, and steer the conversation towards the subject of your change program and what it is, what your aim is, for example. Next thing about communication is an old favorite, which is medium is message. And the way perhaps that you should communicate, people tend to remember, as a generalization, people tend to remember what you do and how you make them feel, right? Not what you say. So actually you choose the medium that's going to reflect the way you want the change to be. So if you want to end up in a more collaborative environment, start your change program in a collaborative way. If you're looking to promote leadership, then engage with the leaders in the organization. If your issue is about developing greater trust and respect, or equality of opportunity in your organization, communicate in that way with people. If it's about delivery and performance, make sure you're delivering and performing. And there's also, on a communication point, there's something worth making, and that is the ugly truth of communication. And it's one of those, the great ugly truth of communication. And that is, if you've got a change program, you want people to get on board with it. One of the things you often hear people say is, they don't get it. Ugly truth of communication is, if they don't get it, you haven't said it, right? So communication, only you can change the way you communicate. It's not the recipient's fault for not understanding what you're trying to convey. So those are a couple of things about communication channels. As I say, main point I'd make there is think more about conversation than communication. Third question we had was, what key leadership attributes can help to facilitate change initiatives? Okay, a couple of things on there. First, let's just nuance that question a little bit. And if we talk about change initiatives, I would always suggest steer a little bit clear of a change initiative. So rather than having an initiative, think about taking the initiative, which is, there's an important difference between those two things. You can then look to the leaders in the organization to drive that, taking that initiative. Now, in terms of leadership attributes, the thing I'd suggest here is that, again, it's a good question, because what it does is it highlights what you might describe as the second principle of change in organizations. And here what we might think about is, we can steal a kind of political slogan, and it's like, it's about leadership stupid. If you want to be good at change, become a student of leadership. That's the advice I'd give on that. And then with regard to leadership, you should look and start where your leaders are at in the organisation. Don't make assumptions about where they start from. So understanding, you'll probably find there's a good sort of latent understanding of leadership in your organisation. So get to know what that is, tap into it. In terms of attributes, and starting where your leaders are at, the story I always recall on this one was some work that I did. It was actually in a naval dockyard, as it happens. We were doing some work with the contractor organisation that was supporting the Royal Navy, and we were also engaged with Royal Navy personnel. And we were doing this particular piece of work. It doesn't matter what it was about. But we met with groups of people, and it was great privilege to meet with a number of groups of people, of managers in the contractor organisation, and senior rates, and personnel and officers in the Royal Navy. And there was when we started this particular programme, it was really quite stark, because we went along and I remember meeting a whole series of groups of managers in the contractor organisation. And to get the conversation flowing, I just ask a throwaway question. And the throwaway question was, who do you look to for leadership? Invariably, what they did was they said, we look, and they would gesticulate and they'd point upwards and say, I look to my boss for leadership, or I look at the top of the shop for leadership. And that was the view that was taken. Next thing I did was go on to, but it was on board a submarine actually, and I met with a group of senior rates and petty officers, chiefs and so on. And to start the conversation, we were sitting in the mess to start the conversation, I asked the same question, who do you look to for leadership here? And the room just went silent. And it was a question that just did not work for these people. It just didn't fit with them. And then one individual spoke to me and he said, well, we don't get that question. I don't understand the relevance of that question. So we don't look anywhere to leadership. We're the leaders. We look here. This is where leadership exists. And that's a really important thing to establish. You know, where in your organization do people think leadership exists? Because actually, if you look at the nature of leadership that you need to get change to happen, it sits in the example of the senior rates, not the example of the contractor organisation. It's actually, leadership is dispersed. The type of leadership you should be looking for in change is very short range. It's 1, maximum 2 degrees of separation, and it's dispersed throughout the organisation, throughout the leadership cohort and cadre in the organisation. So it's important to understand that and then try and drive that in, and to move away from the hierarchical form of leadership that we seem to have grown up with, where there's leader-follower, and more about the collective nature of leadership. Another thing about understanding that question, the key leadership attributes to help facilitate change initiatives, I think it's important actually to think about, to separate 3 ideas out. As we move up through organisations, there are 3 things that we're asked to do. We're asked to direct, we're asked to manage, and we're asked to lead. The more senior we are in the organisation, the more we tend to be asked to direct things. In the middle ranks, we're asked to manage things. In all ranks, actually, we're asked to lead. And I think it's important to understand the differences between those 3 things, because actually, to get the change programme to be successful, you need to do those 3 things. You need to direct the programme, you need to manage the task, and you need to lead the people. And so you might think about those 3 things substantively, treat them as different ideas, and then think about the attributes that you need on each of those. Because often when we talk about what leadership attributes do we need, we're often talking about what attributes do we need in terms of how we direct, what attributes do we need in terms of how we manage, and what attributes do we need in terms of how we lead. And those are distinct ideas. And the third thing to say about leadership attributes is, again, in a change program, actually, is to think about 3 themes. And that is about individual leadership, and what effect we want from individual leadership. And a change program, really, if it's running well, a change program should be seen by individuals as an opportunity for self-development, an opportunity for themselves to develop their own leadership capabilities and competencies. Second thing is to think about the collective effect of leadership. good example for me was, again, a number of years ago, I did a piece of work. It was in Germany as it happened. And the work involved a company that operated in Germany, in France, and in the United Kingdom. And the client who we were doing the work with, he said to me, well, he said, I've got the leaders in my organization, and I want them to work collectively, even though they don't sit next to each other and they're dispersed geographically. I want a collective effect. I want my leaders to be the life force in the organization. I want them to animate the culture here. And that was a really interesting idea. How do we collectively get the life force in the organization to work? So there's individual leadership and there's a collective effect and collective force. And that's one of the things to think about. Interesting, in that example, actually, we could use a verb that was pretty much the same in English, German, and French when we talked about animating the organization. And the third thing to then look at also is the corporate angle on this. How do we support the development of our leadership? How do we create a demand for effective leadership and leadership effect in our organization? Okay, so those are a few thoughts to share on that. Next one was, what advice would you give to change leaders to sell their ideas? The advice I would give is don't try and sell your ideas. Actually, when you look at change in organizations, the way your organization will work is more like it behaves in a monopolist. Sorry, let me get this word right. It behaves like a monopsony more than a monopoly. And a monopsony, and it's a monopsony because actually you only have one audience. You only have one place in which you can place your ideas, and that's in your organization. So actually what's more important is the buying process much more than the selling process. So rather than thinking about selling your ideas, think about change as a buying process. And in a buying process, any buying process you like, and change is no different from any other buying process. Indeed, you hear people talk about getting the organization or getting others to buy in to the change or buy into these ideas. And it's actually a good metaphor. So what we're dealing with is a buying process. In any buying process, including change, there are 3 moments of truth. And my suggestion, my prompt would be to think about those 3 moments of truth in your change program. And the first moment of truth is when someone takes your idea and tries it. Now, in most organizations, most of the time, most of the people will have been through some sort of change program before. And the chances are it hasn't really worked that well for them. So when you come along and you announce you're going to change something, a lot of the people that you're talking to will be thinking, oh, here we go again. And in some quarters, I've worked with some organizations, I'm afraid to say some public sector organizations, where it's almost as if they're waiting for the change program to die, like the last one did. It will die on the vine and then we'll wait for the next one to come along and so on. It's not just limited to public sectors. You find it in a whole range of different organizations. The bigger they are, the more likely that's the case. So then the important thing is to get off the idea that we need to change the beliefs of people. So I want you to believe that this time, this change is better than any other that there's been before. Don't try and change anyone's beliefs in change. The thing to do is to get people to suspend their disbelief long enough to try your change idea. Right? So the first thing we want people to do is we actually want them just to suspend disbelief about everything that's gone before and just try your idea. The next moment of truth is when people take this idea back to their workplace and they use it. And at that point, it has to deliver on its promise. What's the promise that's made for this change? What's the promise that they assume for this change? And does it work? And then the third moment of truth is when things work in the workplace, you get people asking those around them also to adopt your change ideas. And those are the 3 moments of truth in the change process. And then 3 moments of truth in the buying process. And it doesn't matter whether you're trying to change something or whether you're selling motor cars. There are those 3 basic moments of truth. And the important thing on those 3 moments of truth, right? And again, if you're going to diagnose what's happening in a change program, is it where it's, maybe it's not going as fast as it should or as effectively as it should, look out for those 3 moments of truth. Have you managed to get people to suspend their disbelief about change and try it? Have you managed to get people to actually take things back to their workplace and try them and really try to get it to work? And then are you encouraging people to move your ideas onto those around them? If you're going to think about selling your ideas, then actually that third moment of truth is important, because you don't sell to people, you sell through others. And the other thing to note is at each moment, at each of those 3 moments, ask for what you want. Because again, one of the things you find is that often you'll have a change program put out, AIM will go out, everyone gets very excited about it. And then on each of those moments, you ask for the first one, give this change a go, but then miss asking on the next 2 points. So when you try this, really try to get it to work in your workplace. If it works, please ask people around you to use it as well. And that's important. So advice on selling ideas: don't sell, think about it as a buying process. And then the final one is, are there any micro skills you can identify that might facilitate getting buy-in to a change program? This one, you can, again, actually talk all day about it, but the key thing actually is to think about interpersonal skills, because that's I think is more important than perhaps analytical skills, the interpersonal skills, the development and use and flexibility around situational styles. Straightforward one is what's your listen talk ratio, and understand what listening is and the difference between hearing, physiological process, listening, intellectual process. So what's your listen talk ratio? And remember that actually, if you are in the role of leading the change program, then your task is sense making and storytelling. So get good at those 2 things. I think, Julie, that covers the questions. I've probably talked enough. If you want to ask a question that will help make sense of what I've said, please, let's do that.
Andrew, one of the observations I had as you were talking through that is, for me, the 2 key themes that run through all those questions was the importance of the leader to model what they want the employees to do. And secondly, to actually ask them to experiment with new attitudes, behaviors, and actions. And I'm wondering if you would see it that way, or you would want to add something to it.
Yeah, I think the question about modelling is important, and role modelling behaviours. You might look at the role of leadership to do 3 things. Persuade is one of them, and that's where the idea of a buying process comes in. So if you're going to persuade people to do something, there's nothing, and persuade in a very constructive way. So you want your leaders to persuade, and that may well involve developing a relationship with people around them so they can mortgage that and help mortgage a relationship to help persuade. Second thing that you should expect your leaders to do, absolutely, is to model, to role model, right? If you want a particular leadership effect, or if you want an effect of change, then actually you want your leaders to be doing it. Not talking about it, but actually doing it. And the third thing that you may require your leaders to do from time to time is to compel. There is a point which is, if you're going to be part of the organisation, then you do have to adopt the change at some point. And it's so those three things you should look to for your leaders to do. But one of the central ideas, absolutely, I would agree with you, is to model.
Andrew, I've got a question, and I've just taken multiple notes here. Fantastic ideas, but I'm kind of just thinking about in a crisis when an organisation has to change very fast, and the depth of the change is extensive. Have we got time to actually kind of put in place many of these principles, or is it easier just to be very directive and kind of say, sorry, this is how it is, it's this or nothing?
Yeah, good question. And actually there are a couple of answers to that one, actually. I think having an external drive for change is really I would almost go as far as saying essential, actually. I've worked with a number of organisations where change there's been an endeavour to sort of self-motivate change, or there's been talk about getting change to happen, particularly when you find a kind of one of the sectors you mentioned that I work with is defence. Defence is a really interesting sector because it's full of monopolies, monopsony. Right? You've got one manufacturer of something or one supplier of a service, and you've got one buyer. And there's a requirement for some change in that sector. But actually there's no external driver, or there's very little external driver in a monopoly until such time as you approach the switching cost when it's no longer worthwhile for the customers to buy from you. And it's very difficult to get change to happen. If you have an external driver, actually you can tell a story about that. You can explain why and what we're going to do. And there's some external existential threat. And actually it's very useful because you can drive change on that. If you want to end up with a command and control organization at the end of it, take command and control, absolutely. If you don't, then you must take the time and you must engage with people. You can actually engage people very quickly, right, when there is a clear existential threat. One of the things you have to be very careful of, though, is if it really is that much of a crisis, the people in your organization might ask you why you ever let it get to that state. And there is a very good question to ask. If you're genuinely faced with this crisis, unless something that's come completely left field, you probably should have seen it. And that's not going to help you engage with people. But yeah, you know, should you take the time to do it? Yes, I think you should take the time, right, to engage with your people. You should take the time to get communication going. You should take time to understand that you've got a buying process. If there's an urgency to it, then sure, you need to push the pace on it. But the sorts of things I've said, I think that I think you play with fire if you don't actually stick to things that work. You know, command and control is, you know, the crisis management is probably what got you into the crisis in the first place. So you might think about it.
Thank you.
Just to go back on the point, Pete, you're making, which is about experimenting with things. Yeah, I think, again, actually, it depends what you mean by experiment. I think if it's about picking ideas up, trying them, improving them, innovating around them, adopting them, getting them to work, yeah, that's absolutely encourage those ideas, so that you know if you want to know how to I don't know, if you want to know how to dig a trench efficiently, ask the people with the spade. You know, and if you want it done differently, get them to experiment with something, and they'll come up with a solution. So yes, experimenting is important in that context.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. I'd just like to follow that up a little bit. One of the things, certainly in recent times, that a lot of organizations and individuals have had to do is change very rapidly. And oftentimes we may not have a choice about when to change and how to change. So one of the questions that might begin to look at is what might happen if people are not ready, because oftentimes people are ready for change at different paces and speeds.
Yeah. Actually, it comes back, for me, that one comes back to leadership and looking at where the leadership exists in the organization. Which is, if you want to help people and bring them along, then that's a leadership question. If people are not coming on board with you and they're not moving quickly enough, then you must work with your leadership, your leaders in the organization, your leadership cadre that's dispersed through the organization, and look at how you can bring that forward, how you can accelerate things. There is another thing to remember about change, though, is that in any change, in any organization, there are going to be some people who are not going to come with it. You can work with them, you give them the opportunity to come on board, but actually for some it won't suit, and they'll self-select and they'll leave. For others, for whatever reason, they won't come on board, and actually maybe there's a counselling process which suggests that you move on. If you look at the population, you can look at the distribution of people in an organisation. You can look at, there will be some who will be on board with what you're trying to do. They'll be on the front foot. They'll be helping you. They'll be chasing change. There'll be another lot at the tail of it who perhaps will always take time. The thing to think about is actually that group in the middle, and how do we shift sufficient numbers of that group in the middle to get the population to tip in our. Too often, I would suggest, in change programs, there's too much focus on the people on the tail end of the change curve, who speak with a voice that's overemphasized and overweighted. And actually, perhaps what we should be looking at is how we get, a more positive and more constructive message across, and how we get people to come with us. I think that's what I got to say on that one. Does that answer your question for you?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much.
I think that's a really great observation, because so often we kind of see change as a thing that is done to the whole organization, and that people are a body, whereas what we've got to examine is that people have very different perceptions of change. And I think you're quite right in identifying that there are those who embrace, and then there are those who try to escape, and it increases the complexity, isn't it? It's not just a formula that many of the sort of theorists put forward in terms of a linear process of change, which I think is one of the criticisms that I would have of some of the mainstream sort of models and frameworks that have been put forward over sort of the last 20 years or so. So it's very refreshing, that view, Andrew.
Well, thanks for that. I think some of the models, I'm not a big fan of academic models, actually. I think there are some good ones to take ideas from. I think there are, but it's not the world, nothing in the world works quite as cleanly as that. These are approximations.
Indeed.
There's another point which is actually one of the great fallacies of communication, which is you think that, so I've got an organization here, I'm going to communicate to the organization. Communication doesn't work like that. Communication is always one-to-one, right? It's an individual experience that the people you are communicating with have, right? So each individual has a personal experience of communication, and actually you do well to think about it like that. Mm. There was just on academic models, there was a piece of work that we did. Actually, we did it with the University of Birmingham Business School, as it happens. We had an MBA student who was seconded for in the summer. It was a part of the international MBA program, involved working with a company, and we did that for a number of years. And one thing we did was it was really quite neat, because we using an MBA student, we were able to get our MBAs to go out and interview people, who were very senior in their organisations, remarkably so, actually. And doors would open, and which would never open to a consultant to go and ask some questions. And one of the questions we posed for our MBA secondee to go and ask was, oh gosh, sorry, his name's gone out of my mind now. Peter Drucker. Okay, Peter. So how could that go out of my mind? One of the things that Peter Drucker is attributed with is the concept of culture eats strategy for breakfast. Okay, that's one of his. That's a Druckerism. So we thought, oh, that's jolly interesting. Let's go test that idea, shall we? So out goes our MBA. First interview was with a chap who was the CEO of, you know, got a big corporation. And she said, right, so thank you very much for taking the interview with me. So culture eats strategy for breakfast. What do you think? And he said, no, that's absolute rubbish. In fact, he described it as management guru BS, you know. And so that was kind of a real kind of, and he said, no, that's not right. He said, that's not how the world works. That's not the model to adopt. He said, it's a bit like saying which is more important, your heart or your lungs, you know, which you want to work. And actually, no, they both have to work. They're both different things. They have to work together. You know, culture does not trump strategy, nor does strategy trump culture. You have to get these two things working effectively. And so you can take sort of you can take the, you know, some management concepts and go and test them in the real world and see what comes back. And actually, you'll find that there's some real value in them, but it's how you use that. So rather than following it dogmatically, you think, right, okay, what's the approximation in here that we're using, and how can we best use it?
Fantastic. You've just set up our assignment, our group assignment.
Very good.
Excellent. Andrew, this has been absolutely fantastic. And I know that Pete will, you know, have put his thanks in, but, you know, your time has been absolutely invaluable and your insights are fantastic. This is going to have a lot of discussion points for the students. And, you know, I think we're indebted to you for, you know, your contribution to this particular course. So personal thanks from me. I'm sure Pete's got a few words to say.
Yes, same for me. Really appreciate your time and insights into it. And I think one of the things that you've really done for me is to provide your internal sort of thinking, strategy, and approach to change. So oftentimes change agents, or whatever they're going to be called, might have actions they do, but it's the internal thought processes that really make a lot of the difference. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you from all our students as well. I think this is going to, you know, inspire their thinking for some time to come.
Well, so, thank you very much for having me. I hope those ideas are something to kick around and explore. And I hope that you know, moves the program forward. Thank you.
Been a pleasure to work with you on this one, Andrew. Thank you.